Hey everybody, I am going to give you some history about the Logan. So I'm going to put this into full presentation mode. And so you can see this full screen. This is the Logan family tree. Now, what you may not know about this story that we're going to read, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, um, is that most of the black families were not landowners. And it was really, really hard for a black family to become landowners, and even for white families, poor sharecropping white families, to become landowners. And I'm going to tell you the story behind the Logans, because the Logans are the only family in the neighborhood of where they live, the only black family that owns land. And that makes things a lot different for them than it does for everybody else. So I want you to look at this screen here, and you can see the Logan family tree. Now, our story takes place with the Logans here, David and Mary, our mama and dad of our story, and we will see Uncle Hammer, whose real name is Luke, and then here's the four kids. We've got Stacy, he goes by Stacy. Robert Stacy's his name. We have Cassie, we have Christopher John, and we have Clayton Jr., who goes by Little Man. And you'll see why he's called Little Man as we read the story. So back in the days, if you go back further, now this was happening in the 1930s, but if you go back further and you go this direction and you follow, here's Caroline Big Ma. So Big Ma is in our story. She's the grandma of David and Mary, and she lives with the family of David and Mary. She lives with them. And then she had other children, Kevin and Mitchell, and we'll hear about what happened to them. And then Uncle Hammer and David, who's in our story. Now, she was married to a man named Paul Edward. Now, if you look at Paul Edward, Edward had his mother, Deborah, over here. Now, Deborah was a black slave, and she ended up having a child with Edward, who was the white slave owner at the time. So Edward actually was a plantation owner, and he owned several slaves, and one of his slaves was Deborah. Now, Edward fell in love with Deborah, but he couldn't marry her. I don't know if you remember, but the laws stated that you were not allowed to marry someone who was black. But he loved her, and she worked for him in her home, and they ended up having a child together, and his name was Paul Edward. And Edward raised Paul Edward as his very own son. So Paul Edward grew up with his white brothers, because Edward had other children, and he grew up with his white brothers. And when they were little, that didn't mean anything. It didn't make a difference to them. They all played together. They were kids who played together. When they grew up, it began to be some problems for them, because Paul Edward was black. His white brothers were receiving a lot of they were hearing from a lot of their friends saying, why do you even spend time with him? You know, he's just a black kid. Why would you even spend time with him? And so it got to be difficult for Paul Edward to be living in the house with his white brothers. Now, the story goes on actually here too, that during the time that his mother was a slave, the Civil War took place, and after the Civil War ended, Deborah was no longer a slave. So Edward and Deborah, they lived in the same home together, but she was no longer a slave because she was a free African American now. And but Paul Edward eventually was sent away by his father, who was white. His father sent him away, and because he loved him like a son, because Paul Edward was his son, he sent him away to learn a trade, because he wanted him to be educated, and he learned how to make furniture. So Paul Edward was sent away, learned how to make furniture, and with that, he was able to learn how to make money selling furniture. He got quite good at it. Now, Paul Edward was also, because he was mixed race, his father was white and his mother was black, he could really pass as a white man. If you saw him on the street, you'd even think he was a white man. His skin was very light, not white as white, but kind of light. Paul Edward started making furniture, and he started saving his money. And after the Civil War, if you don't know what happened, after the Civil War, a lot of the Southerners had to sell their land to people from the North, because they were broke. They didn't have any money. they had lost the war and their Confederate money wasn't worth anything. And so a lot of them had to sell their land, and Northerners were buying up their land. Well, Paul Edward had made some money, saved it, and put it aside from selling furniture. It was very rare that again that an African American young man would be able to have a job and be able to make the kind of money he was making. And he fell in love with this piece of land, and this piece of land happened to be owned by a white Northerner. And eventually, Paul Edward made enough money to offer the amount of money that this Northerner was selling it for. Now, if this land, again, you need to understand why this is so rare. If this land had been owned by a Southern white man, he would have never sold it to a black man. But because the land was owned by someone from the North, he didn't care, because in the North things were different. So he sold his land to Paul Edward, a black man. And Paul Edward then took this land and owned this acreage. Now, this is acreage that you'll hear a lot about in our story. And the blacks and the white people in the area were very, very unhappy that he actually owned this land, because they just didn't like it that black people were owning the land. They wanted to keep them poor. They wanted to keep them sharecroppers. And you're going to hear about the man who owned all the other land in the county. And he used to own the land that Paul Edward, now owned. And he does everything he can to try to get this land back from him and try to force him to sell it or try to force him out of business, but he can't do it. And so in our story, the Logans, who is the main part of our story, they are landowners. Paul Edward married Caroline. Paul Edward eventually died. Caroline Big Ma is the grandma in our story, and we're going to hear about them. But the Logans are landowners, and so although they're not wealthy, they're a lot better off than most of the people in our story. I just wanted you to know that background to our story before we begin reading today. So hopefully you will enjoy as we read the beginning chapters of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Mr. Hooksher's personal favorite story that we'll be reading this year.